I work most efficiently when everything is in order. I read the document from beginning to end because skipping steps is often the cause of errors. If the process is done correctly, I expect it to finish smoothly. Grimm doesn't have that patience. He lingers, pacing around the room, joking about things he doesn't understand, then laughing too soon, as if that laughter itself could protect him. Mara is different from both of us. She repeats operations without complaining. If a step doesn't complete the document, she assumes that step needs to be redone, rechecked, and repeated until a result is obtained. The document before me is labeled Planet 6. A survey team had been deployed earlier along an approved route with clearly defined tasks and complete documentation. All authorizations had been granted, all checklists had been marked as completed. Procedurally, the work progressed exactly as expected. No pending requests, no missing forms, no unresolved approvals. The documentation should have been archived. Instead, it was still active. Nothing in the documentation indicated why it hadn't been closed. According to the system, the mission was completed according to procedure, but according to the record status, it wasn't. The previous team had a report of a drowning person, but then the signal was lost completely. No distress signals, no communication interruptions, no environmental changes were recorded. The last drone scans showed several areas of shallow and deep water with personal equipment concentrated near the shore. Buoys were retrieved, equipment was recorded. Nothing indicated a struggle or evacuation attempt. The people assigned to the mission simply never returned to the system. Their equipment was still there. Their roadmap is not yet complete. I started by opening the document. The first part, with its environmental summary, wasn't because it usually provided the answer, but because it determined whether anything following should be restricted. Planet 6 was listed as having vast areas of water, distributed in irregular basins rather than continuous oceans. Water depth varied over short distances. Some areas were shallow enough to stand on, others several meters deep with no noticeable gradient. Visibility was inconsistent. In deeper areas, the water remained slightly murky, but still allowed visibility several meters below the surface. In shallower areas, the water was murky, obscuring even parts of the body submerged. No currents were recorded strong enough to affect movement. Temperatures remained within acceptable limits for prolonged exposure. Light hit the surface evenly, with no sharp reflections or dark areas. I paused at that point and reread the passage. Nothing here suggests an environment requiring immediate caution. Swimming, wading, and surface movement are all listed as permitted without time limits. I move on to how the data was collected and validated. Initial scans were performed from orbit, mapping the distribution of water bodies and identifying depth variations through reflection and absorption patterns. These results were then verified by drone flights at low altitudes. The drones entered the atmosphere, glided over the surface, and hovered over selected locations. The visual images were clear above the water surface. Below the surface, the sensors obtained limited information due to turbidity, which was noted but not considered an error. The same locations were scanned multiple times. The results were consistent. The equipment did not detect large masses moving below the surface. No pressure changes were recorded. No abrupt changes occurred between flights. After the first group landed, their personal equipment continued transmitting position data normally until the last recorded point. There were no gaps indicating interference. Where measurements were repeated, the values were within the allowable error range. From a technical standpoint, the collection and verification process appeared to be complete. The survey history was brief and unremarkable. A single group was deployed to Planet 6, following an approved route that passed through several bodies of water identified during the drone review. The mission was to directly inspect and confirm those areas. The movement logs showed steady progress. Timestamps were evenly distributed. There were no stops long enough to indicate danger or hesitation. The communication log remained clean until a complete halt. The final entries showed the group was near one of the deeper water areas. After that point, there were no further transmissions. No signs of emergency appeared. No automated alerts were triggered. When the drones were deployed along the same route, they found no personnel. Instead, they noted floating equipment, damaged or partially submerged floating equipment, and personal instruments concentrated near the edge of some deeper basins. The distribution of these items did not indicate a single incident. It appeared to be spread across multiple locations along the route. I read to the end and noted what prevented closing the record. Personnel assigned to Planet 6 were never recorded as having returned. The issued equipment was not fully recovered. No recorded cause of loss could trigger escalation according to current criteria. At the same time, the lack of confirmation of return prevented archiving the file. Everything that could be remotely verified had been verified. The environment was deemed suitable. The data was consistent. The survey history showed no procedural errors, only an abrupt ending. I reread the final notes and found nothing new. The profile had reached a stage where further review was no longer helpful. The only remaining step was direct verification under the same conditions. I marked the profile as suitable and requested permission to deploy on the surface. Planet 6 required direct verification. The carrier brought us to position while the landing hatch stabilized. 7 names were confirmed on the deployment list: myself, Mara, Grimm, and 4 signed escorts moving across the water. The module detached without resistance. The transition was smooth, mostly due to pressure rather than movement. Grimm adjusted his seatbelt twice, feeling his helmet straps for looseness, true to his timid nature, then stopped touching them altogether. Mara checked the environmental indicators, closed the control panel, then reopened it to confirm the same values. No one said anything. The carrier gradually shrank on the screen until the surface of Planet 6 filled the frame. The module descended steadily and stopped near the edge of a wide basin where the water spread out in irregular sections. The landing proceeded normally. When the hatch opened, the air felt neutral. Light reflected off the water's surface evenly and diffusely. The escorts went out first, checking the boundary between land and water. Nothing had changed. Mara followed and signaled to proceed. Grimm was the last of us to step out, pausing long enough to look down at the water's depth before moving. I noted the conditions and confirmed their suitability for the file. The first stretch of water sloped gently from solid ground down into shallow, murky water. At the edge of the bank, the bottom was completely obscured. A few steps further in, a side area of water had a sudden change in depth. The water darkened, but simultaneously became clearer, allowing visibility of 2 to 3 meters below the surface. No currents were visible. The surface remained still, only disturbed by our movements. After a brief pause, we chose the deeper section, as it looked safer. Standing still in this shallow, dark water felt more unpredictable than swimming, where at least some of the depth could be observed. The guides went ahead, the 2 of us behind, maintaining a natural distance. Their movements were controlled and unhurried. We adjusted our oxygen tanks and tight swimsuits. Grimm was closer to the center than usual, constantly glancing down. He said nothing. I observed the intervals between us and the reaction on the water's surface. Nothing reacted. The water closed behind us without leaving any lasting disturbance. We proceeded through several interconnected basins. Some sections forced us to wade through shallow, murky water where our feet disappeared from view after just a few steps. Others opened up to deeper waters where swimming was easier and the movement smoother. This change was noticeable but not alarming. No one showed signs of fatigue. Grimm slowed down once, kicked and rubbed his hands together as if reacting to the temperature, then continued swimming without explanation. Mara checked our course against the markers and made slight adjustments, leading us to the next confirmed position. The escorts observed the surface of the water more than the depth. The equipment remained steady. Nothing obstructed movement or distance. From the surface, the deeper water was still clear enough to give the impression of control. I noted this stability and continued taking notes. We entered a wider area of deeper water and spread out slightly to maintain formation. The water here reflected the sky in fragmented patches. I was recording the position when one of the escorts, swimming a few meters to my left, stopped. At first, it seemed deliberate, as if adjusting his swimsuit. Then his head submerged below the surface. No sound, no sudden movement. The water enveloped him with a short ripple that spread out and then disappeared. We instinctively slowed down and called his name. No response. No bubbles rose to the surface. The water below seemed unchanged. We searched in controlled arcs, but nothing appeared. No equipment surfaced. There was no sign of where he had sunk. We swam to that spot and searched, but found nothing. Grim remained afloat, breathing irregularly, staring down at the water with a terrified expression. Mara signaled us to tighten our formation. After a while of searching, I noted the disappearance as observed. Sudden sinking, no apparent cause, no body found. After the unsuccessful search, we continued moving. The water ahead looked exactly the same as behind, with no explanation and no warning. We didn't leave the water immediately after the first loss of sight. The water quickly became still again, as if nothing had happened. I recorded the last confirmed position, adjusted for drift direction, and timed it. The remaining escorts followed closely, reducing the distance without instruction. Grim floated stiffly, keeping his head above water, breathing more heavily than before. Mara checked the distance between us, then the direction toward the nearest shallow bank. When there was no further movement, she signaled for us to move forward. We continued, more slowly, prioritizing areas of water that appeared deeper and clearer. No one objected. The assumption was formed in our minds. Whatever had happened, it had happened without warning, and remaining in open water without support was no longer acceptable. After a short while, we stopped near a section of water that widened again. The depth here was uneven, dark in the middle, murky near the edges. We decided to deploy the life raft after the first death. The bag was opened, and the emergency raft was released. It inflated properly and stabilized on the water. I automatically counted the available space. The raft could support 5 people without being overloaded. We had 6. At first, no one said anything. No matter how many times we checked, the calculation didn't change. One escort volunteered to stay underwater and cling to the raft's edge. He was a very good swimmer. The conditions seemed manageable. Grim protested weakly, although he knew he was allowed to stay on the raft, then fell silent when there was no other option. The decision was not to be debated. It was accepted as a temporary compromise. We rearranged our positions around the raft. The 5 of us carefully positioned ourselves, distributing our weight evenly. The remaining escorts stayed beside us, one hand gripping the reinforced edge of the raft, kicking steadily to maintain rhythm. The movement continued. The raft dragged slightly, but remained stable. The water didn't react immediately. I watched the escort's arm closely, noting the tension in his fist and his breathing. He didn't struggle. He didn't cry for help. For a few moments, everything went as expected. Then the buoy suddenly tilted to one side on this escort's side. Not violently, but enough to break the balance. The escort's fist clenched reflexively. His body sank lower, pulled by something invisible. He didn't have time to scream. His arm went below the surface, and then he disappeared. The buoy swayed again, then stabilized. The water submerged him without resistance. We stopped immediately. The buoy drifted gently before stabilizing again, bubbles rising to the surface. No disturbance remained. An escort leaned over the edge of the buoy, groping down into the water, but felt nothing. Grim huddled on the raft, panic replacing caution, until Mara pushed him back into position. I noted the second loss as it occurred, a sudden sinking, as if something were pulling it down, with no apparent cause, beyond saving. The consequences were now undeniable. 2 losses right beside us, both occurring while moving, both without warning. We were no longer choosing between shallow and deep water. We were choosing between moving and not moving at all. The raft remained our only option, even if it meant losing another person. We adjusted our position once more, this time more tightly, and continued forward, aware that whatever was happening underwater didn't require us to dive completely in to save someone. The float carried us further than I expected.
Not fast, not smooth, but stable enough to keep us on course. No one said anything. Weight was redistributed instinctively, small adjustments made without discussion. Grim held his position, his hands gripping the edge of the float, his eyes fixed on the water ahead rather than looking down. Mara observed the water around the float, checking its reaction to each movement. I focused on balance and drift, keeping the float line as straight as possible. The water didn't react immediately. For a few minutes, the float was functioning exactly as designed. That stability was the only thing that reassured me. The first sign of failure was subtle. The float began to pull slightly to one side, not enough to alarm anyone, but enough to warrant adjustment. Mara shifted position, then another followed. The pull returned, this time more stable, accompanied by a slight vibration through the material beneath us. It felt more like contact than pressure, as if something underneath had touched the underside. There was no collision, no sound on the water's surface. The float didn't deflate. It continued to support our weight, but the movement was no longer balanced. I leaned forward and saw a thin, irregular line forming along one of the seams. Water slowly seeped in, darkening the material's surface. We slowed down almost to a complete stop. No one panicked. The float remained afloat, but its shape began to warp, sagging slightly where the water had pooled. An escort tried to adjust the patch, pressing it against the seam, but the material deformed under his hand. The leak was relentless. It widened gradually instead of tearing completely. Grim noticed the change immediately. He recoiled, nearly losing his balance, then stood still as Mara steadied the float with a decisive motion. I documented the damage and estimated the time before the pontoon would lose its structural integrity. It wasn't instantaneous, it wasn't a catastrophe, it was inevitable. We remained in place while we reconsidered our options. Staying on the pontoon meant waiting for it to completely fail. Returning would mean crossing the same body of water we had decided to cross. Moving forward with the pontoon would only exacerbate the damage. No one suggested a complete repair. The material wasn't designed to withstand repeated stress. The natural choice narrowed. The pontoon had given us time. That time was running out. Mara looked into my eyes for a moment, then nodded once. Grim swallowed hard and said nothing. The remaining escorts loosened their grip, bracing themselves. I noted the decision, as it was made, without hesitation. We left the pontoon one by one, maintaining contact until the very last moment. The water surrounded us again, colder than before, heavier now that we no longer had anything to hold on to. The life raft drifted a little, still afloat, still damaged, no longer useful. We huddled together in the water, closer than before, and began to move on our own. No one hurried, no one lingered. The surface of the water ahead looked no different than it had a few minutes earlier. We continued swimming, aware that we had no safer option, only one option left.
The decision to continue swimming didn't last long. We had barely managed to re-establish our distance when the movement ahead was interrupted. One of the remaining escorts jerked violently, as if his swim had been cut short. His body tilted forward, then fell. There was no cry, no frantic kicking. He was pulled beneath the surface with a force that didn't radiate outward, only downward. The water above him closed in too quickly. For a fraction of a second, I could still see his form fading into the darker water below. Then it vanished. I didn't have time to think. I took a breath and dove down, pushing hard, ignoring the pressure in my ears. The remaining escort immediately followed, another body parting beside me, close enough for me to feel the shift in my arm. The water changed the moment we submerged. The light faded, the shapes became flat. A few meters down, the transparency abruptly ended, replaced by a darker, more opaque void where the bottom should have been. At its bottom was a hole, unusually round and clean, as if the bottom itself had been erased. From that hole, something moved. A pale shape was wrapping around the legs and waist of the escort. I grabbed his shoulder and pulled. For a moment, I felt his body react, felt the resistance lessen slightly. Then the pole below tightened. Another section emerged from the gap and wrapped higher, around his neck. I reached out again, this time with both hands, my fingers sliding on the stretched fabric. The other man beside me grasped his arm. Together we pulled. The force below didn't jerk or thrash. It simply continued, steadily and absolutely, pulling him down centimeter by centimeter. I kicked harder, bracing against empty space, trying to create leverage where there wasn't. My hand slid down his arm to his wrist. For a moment, I thought we could hold him. Then the grip beneath shifted. The pressure increased, not violently, but enough to make an unmistakable difference. The arm in my grasp was violently pulled away, abruptly yanked out, leaving my hands empty. His body vanished into the gap below, the faint movement receding with it. The hole remained there for another moment, then the darkness closed in as if it had never existed. The water around us became still. Only then did I realize I had held my breath for too long. The other man had begun to surface. I followed, my lungs feeling like they were about to burst, the image of the hole haunting my vision. We both surfaced. Air rushed in too quickly, tearing through our airways. I heard screams, Grimm's voice, high-pitched and out of control. Then hands grabbed us, pulling us closer. The water's surface remained unchanged. No bubbles marked where he had sunk, no trace of disturbance. I surfaced long enough to orient myself, then tried to slow my breathing. The other diver clung to me, trembling, trying to speak but failing. I didn't answer Grimm when he asked what I had seen. I still hadn't found the right words. Mara led us toward the nearest shore, her gesture decisive and clear. I let her lead, my arms heavy, my hands still feeling the shape of a body no longer there. We didn't return to the water, not to search, not to confirm. Something beneath us had taken 3 lives without hesitation. That was enough.
We reached the shore without looking back. Hands touched the ground, knees scraped against the rocks and compacted earth. Water streamed from our swimsuits and pooled at our feet before soaking away. Grimm collapsed first, coughing violently and then vomiting, his hands trembling as he tried to control it. The other escort stood a few steps away, hunched over, palms on his thighs, breathing so heavily he could barely speak. Mara immediately sprang into action, pulling us further away from the edge of the cliff, counting us silently. I stayed near the water's surface long enough to confirm that nothing was following us out. The water remained unchanged. No movement disturbed it. No sound rose from below. When we were far enough away that I could no longer feel the drag on my ankles, I marked the spot and tried to breathe steadily. No one offered to turn back. No one asked me what I had seen below. Grimm tried to speak once, then stopped himself, swallowing the words he was about to utter. The escort stared at the water's surface as if expecting it to rise on its own. Mara checked around and established a range to help us orient ourselves without bringing us closer to the waterholes. I opened the surface map and overlaid the drone's flight paths for analysis to verify the match. The markers matched. The deeper areas we had passed were the same areas where the drone had recorded the buoyancy device from the previous team. That pattern was still correct. Every missing person we recorded, ours and theirs, occurred in places where the water allowed the body to disappear beneath. I was only recording that as an observation, not a conclusion, not an explanation. I shifted the overlay to highlight the shallower areas. Data from the drone showed those areas were all opaque, their bottoms unreadable from above, but their depth readings were consistent. Shallow enough to stand on, shallow enough to only reach our necks. I checked the incident log again. No missing persons were recorded in those areas. The equipment was found nearby, not inside. That absence was significant. It didn't prove safety, it just showed a difference. Grimm noticed the map behind my shoulder and leaned closer, careful not to step into the water as he did. He didn't point, he didn't ask, he just followed the shapes with his eyes. Mara compared the overlaid map to the terrain we could see, using his finger to trace the ridges dividing the basins into smaller sections. The problem was accessibility. The shallow waters weren't concentrated into a single continuous area. They alternated between deeper waters interrupted by deep areas that forced swimmers to leave the bottom. Moving directly from where we were standing to any of these areas would require crossing water we knew was unsafe.
I adjusted the scale and narrowed the filter. A pattern gradually emerged, initially indistinct. A series of shallow platforms crisscrossed the basin, each platform connected to the next by narrow strips where the depth only increased momentarily before receding again. This series was uneven, incomplete in some places, but it existed. A route preferring footing over floating. A path that wouldn't require swimming if followed correctly. I marked it without considering it a solution. We stood there longer than necessary, weighing what the map indicated against what we had seen with the naked eye. No one argued about certainty. Nothing was certain. The shallow water was murky. We couldn't see what lay beneath. All we knew was what hadn't happened there yet. I closed the cover and looked down at the water again, this time with the map fixed in my head. If we moved, we had to follow that sequence, one step at a time, never losing contact with the land, never venturing into the deep water that had claimed the lives of 3 of us. It wasn't a certainty, it was just a possibility. The only remaining possibility didn't require us to swim. I noted the route as a hypothesis and fixed the equipment. When I looked up, Mara was already heading toward the first shallow water platform. Grim was near me, breathing more evenly, his eyes fixed on the land ahead. We hadn't tested the water yet. We were deciding how to approach it.
We moved silently into the shallow water. The first steps were cautious, almost ritualistic. Each foot slowly descended until it encountered resistance, then paused long enough to ensure the ground didn't sink. The water was murky from knee down. I couldn't see my feet as we lifted them out of the water. The inability to see forced us to maintain a different rhythm. We advanced in short bursts, checking beach area before shifting our weight. I led, sensing changes in depth by feel. Grim was close enough for me to feel his movement in the water, his breathing controlled but rapid. The other followed behind, his eyes fixed on the nearby deeper water. Nothing reacted. The pressure didn't change. The water remained heavy and unresponsive. We followed the marked line, stepping from one shallow ledge to another. Where the depth increased momentarily, we stopped and reassessed, adjusting our angle until we were back at the bottom. Progress was slow, but it was progress. The silence became a distinct presence. Each splash seemed louder than usual. Each pause lasted longer than necessary. Yet nothing reached us. The water remained murky and thick, preventing us from seeing what lay beneath, and preventing anything below from having the space to move to the surface. I noted the distance as we went, not for the number's importance, but for the act of writing which helped steady my hand. Grim immediately stumbled for a moment, his limbs flailing. For a split second, a voice in my head spoke, "Damn it!" But then, when nothing happened, he straightened up as if nothing had happened. The final shallow ledges of rock led us out of the depression completely. The water thinned, then disappeared, leaving damp ground beneath our feet. We weren't in a hurry. We weren't celebrating. We walked until the sound of the water faded behind us and the ground felt solid beneath our feet. Only then did we stop. I counted again. 4. No more people were being transported. I marked the route as feasible, not safe. That difference was crucial. The records would reflect that difference. Planet 6 wasn't well understood. It had become habitable, under repeatable conditions. That was enough to complete the mission at hand. The transport ship picked us up immediately. No one spoke during the ascent. Grim slept most of the time, eventually exhaustion overshadowing fear. Mara reviewed the route one last time and turned off the screen. I finished my notes in silence. 3 fatalities, a confirmed route. No attempt was made to categorize the cause beyond the observable limits. The file closed without incident. Then, when the procedures were finished and the details were no longer urgent, the pattern remained. We had chosen the stream of water that allowed us to see, and it had claimed many lives without warning. We escaped through water that showed us nothing. On Planet 6, transparency doesn't equate to safety, and opacity doesn't equate to danger.
What matters isn't what we can see beneath the surface, but whether the ground stays with us as we step on it.